This is a familiar passage of Scripture for many of us. In 1 Samuel 17 is the story of David and Goliath. A story that no doubt we've all heard before, and a story I believe I've even preached from before here. But I want us to look again at this story this morning and see what it is that we can learn from it. Maybe even something new today. And so if you would, we're going to read the first couple verses and then we'll go from there, and I'll read several verses from this chapter. We're going to read the first 4 verses this morning to begin our message. Follow along, if you would, with me this morning, beginning in verse 1. The Bible says, "Now the Philistines gathered together their armies to battle, and were gathered together at Shokal, which belonged to Judah, and pitched between Shokal and Azekah in Ephidim." Verse 2. "Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together and pitched by the valley of Elah, and set the battle in array against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on a mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, and there was a valley between them. And there went out a champion of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span." I want us to look at this morning, this passage here. A couple things that I want us to see about this passage, and I want to talk about this thought this morning: in the land of giants. In verse 4, we're introduced to a man named Goliath. The Bible describes him, it says his height was 6 cubits in a span. And going based upon roughly the estimates of how long a cubit and a span were at that time, it is estimated that Goliath was to be about 9 feet tall. Taller, no doubt, than any man in Israel. And taller than most of the soldiers, much taller than the average soldier in the Israelite army. And as this giant comes out, and understand the Philistines and the Israelites were constantly at war with each other, constantly battling each other. The Philistines were wanting to invade and conquer them. And the Bible gives us a picture here in the first 3 verses that they come together at 2 hillsides, and it says that they pitched by the valley of Elah. So give you a little bit of understanding of what the scene looks like this morning. The Philistine army is pitched on this mountaintop over here, and the Israelite army is pitched on this mountaintop over here, and between them is a great valley where the battle would take place. And as they stand there looking at each other, from the Philistine army comes this giant Goliath, and he comes into that valley and he begins to cry out to them. And this is the scene that is before us. So I want us to notice a couple things, 4 things about this passage this morning, and we'll be done. But number 1, I want us to notice the men present at the battle. The men present at the battle. First of all, we see the Philistines are there. Verse 3 tells us that the Philistines stood on the mountain on one side. And I want us to notice a certain Philistine, Goliath. Beginning in verse 4, we get the introduction of Goliath. It tells us there went out a champion of the camp. So we clearly know that he was a great warrior, that he had accomplished some great things, some battles, some fights. He had no doubt killed many men. He had no doubt won many wars and fights for them. But the Bible tells us he was a great champion. It tells us his height, and in verse 5 it says he had a helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass, and he had greaves of brass upon his legs, and a target of brass between his shoulders, and the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam. And his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and one bearing a shield went before him. He begins to describe Goliath, all the armor that he had, the great defense that he had, his spear, his shield that he had, and it is describing this great, huge warrior that stands before the Israelites and looks unbeatable. To who had ever faced him, they had lost. They had been killed. To everyone who had tried to cross him, they no longer were crossing anybody. And Goliath now stood before the Israelites, having conquered every other person he had confronted, and was now confronting the Israelites, and they were unable to move forward. Not only the Philistines present at this battle, but notice the Israelites. Verse 3 also tells us that the Israelites stood on a mountain on the other side, and there was a valley between them. Notice certain Israelites. Look at the son of Jesse. The sons of Jesse. In verse 12, we begin to get a picture about some of the men that are in this army of Israel. In verse 12 it tells us, now David was the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse. And he had 8 sons, and the men went among men from an old man in the days of Saul. And the 3 eldest sons of Jesse went and followed Saul to the battle. The names of the 3 sons that went to battle were Eliab, the firstborn, and next unto him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. And David was the youngest, and the 3 eldest followed Saul. But David went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. The war breaks out, and Saul calls upon his army, and he calls of all the men in the country to come and fight. And so David's 3 oldest brothers head out into battle. They head with Saul to the war. And so as they're camped out here, looking at each other and looking at Goliath, they realize that they're not up for the battle. Not only, first of all, the men present at the battle, but secondly, the giant who proclaimed blasphemy. Look at this, Goliath's prideful railings. In verse 8 through 10, it tells us how Goliath every day would come forward into that valley, and he would look out on the camp of Israel, and he would say, send me your best warrior, send me your champion. And he said, someone come fight me. He gives them a deal. He says, if you send a man and he's able to kill me, we will surrender to you. He says, but if you lose to me, then you shall surrender to me, to the Philistines. And the Bible tells us he defied the armies of Israel. Every day, day after day after day, Goliath comes forward and begins to call out the Israelites, begins to call out their God, begins to call them names, begins to attack them. And every day the fear of Goliath grew greater in the hearts of the Israelites. Not only Goliath's prideful railing, but then see the Israelites' pitiful response. Verse 11. When Saul and all Israel heard the words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. I mean, these are the Israelites. This is the people of God. This is the nation that has God on their side. And the Bible tells us that all things are possible through Christ. It ought to be that they looked at that giant and thought, he's nothing compared to God. We can win this. Saul, the king of Israel, the leader of Israel, ought to have had the courage and the faith to believe that God would deliver him. But the Bible tells us that instead they were afraid and fearful. The Israelites' pitiful response. But not only, number one, first of all, we saw the men present at the battle. Then we saw the giant who proclaimed blasphemy. But then we see a deliverer provided for the battle. Verse 20 through 27, we are told how Jesse begins to worry about his sons. They've been gone for quite some time. Normally a battle wouldn't take this long, but the Israelites were too afraid to fight. Struck in fear, unable to move, unable to do anything, and he begins to worry about his sons, so he gets David and he sends him down to the battle, to the camp, with some food and some things for his sons. And when David gets there, he hears Goliath come out. Right about the time David gets to the camp is when Goliath comes out to give his daily speech to the Israelites. He hears this speech. And he's angered by it. And he begins to look around and wonder, why isn't anybody doing anything about this? And we know the story is his brother comes out and he tells him, hey, why don't you be quiet or Goliath's going to hear you. You're just here to snoop around and check out the scene. He says, you need to go home. You don't want to mess with Goliath. Verse 28. The Bible says Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spake unto the men. And Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, why comest thou down hither? And with whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know thy pride and the naughtiness of thy heart, for thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle. He said, David, you need to go home and take care of those sheep. You're only here because you want to check out the battle. David gives a response here in verse 29. Listen to this. What have I now done? Is there not a cause? David flips this right around on his brother. He said, you're going to stand here and accuse me of what I'm doing? He says, what about what you're not doing? Is there not a cause? Some of the most famous words of the Old Testament, no doubt, when David begins to give them this call of, is there not a cause to fight the enemies of God? Verse 30, it says, he turned from him toward another and spake after the same manner, and the people answered him again after the former manner. David begins to go through and he realizes not just his brothers are afraid, but all of Israel is afraid. We know the story. Saul, he goes to Saul and he tells Saul, he says, I will go and I will fight that battle. I will fight Goliath. And Saul tries to put his armor on him, and his armor's too big. And I was thinking about the VeggieTales episode of this story, and it's hanging off him, and the helmet's over his head, and David tells him, he says, I don't need your armor. He says, I just need my sling. And think about this. Remember, Goliath's deal with them is, send me a warrior, and whoever wins, the other side has to surrender. Saul's looking at David. David is just probably a teenage boy at this point, maybe 15, 16 years old. David is probably maybe 5 foot tall at best, because the Israelite men were not very tall. And so here comes little David, and he's going up to huge giant Goliath. And when you look at this battle, it should look like it is a clear-cut decision who's going to win this fight. David goes forth into battle, and he takes his sling, and all of Israel is watching in fear, and he takes his sling and those 5 stones that he has, and he releases that sling. And notice when he gives a description of his armor, of Goliath's armor, the one place that he could kill him or could hit him was his face. And he throws that stone and it hits him between the eyes, the Bible says, and he falls dead. David goes and pulls that giant sword of Goliath. The Bible tells us that he cut off his head, and that the armies of the Israelites experienced great victory, and they experienced moving forward. But lastly, I want us to notice here the depiction of the battle. As David comes down to fight Goliath, 9 foot tall Goliath, maybe 5 foot tall teenage David. I mean, it doesn't look fair. It'd be like if Isaac tried to come up here tonight and wrestle with me. Think you could wrestle with me? He thinks he could. And you know, for years and years, I read this passage and I heard it preached. If we could just be like David, we can conquer the giants in our life. And let me say this morning that every one of us has some giants in our life that have held us back from accomplishing some things. Some fears, some sins, some addictions, whatever it is. There are giants in our life that have plagued us and haunted us, that day after day after day stand up when we wake up and they tell us, you're not good enough. You're not strong enough. You can't do this. You can't do that. And we have lived in fear. And for years I was told, if you could just be like David, if you could just have the courage and faith of David, you could conquer those. But as I read this passage, I find out very clearly, I'm not David, and you are not David either. And we can't be David. You know who we are? We're David's older brothers who are hiding in fear in the camp. Stuck, unable to move forward, unable to fight, because we've allowed the giants in our life to grow so big that we can't even fathom fighting them. You and I are not David, but if David pictures in our life, not us, but he pictures Jesus. Let me say this morning, that if David had not come, the Israelites would have stood in fear for months, maybe even years, until Goliath was so powerful in their minds. I believe Goliath could have walked through the camp and single-handedly took them all out. Fear plays a big part in our life. And when we become afraid of something, our will to fight against it shrinks. David is a picture of Jesus. Let me say this morning that if you and I are going to ever fight and defeat the giants in our life, we have got to call upon God to fight them for us. And let me say this. We can't be like Saul and say, God, I want you to fight the giants in my life, but I want you to wear my armor and use my sword and do it my way. We can't ask God to fight our giants, but do it how we want Him to do it. We've got to trust God to fight them how He is going to do it. I believe this morning that we have giants in our life. I have many. And I believe today that Christians all over the world are stuck in fear, unable to move forward in the will of God because of these giants. I don't know what they are in your life, but you do. And you know that they have held you back from doing things. The fear of failure, the fear of being able to witness, the fear of being able of ridicule, of mockery, or whatever it is. The giants of sin that have gotten a hold of your life. The sin that maybe even you have kept hidden from the world, but God knows about, that you've allowed to control your life and grow to a point where you feel like you could never conquer it or get away from it. But this morning I'm asking you not to try to fight your giants on your own anymore. Amen. Give up. Because it's time that we let God fight them for us. It is going to take us relinquishing our pride and our control over the situations in our lives in order to be able to get through them. Saul had to be willing to give up complete control of the situation to David to defeat Goliath. You know how this story ends? Once David defeats Goliath, the Bible tells us that he throws that stone and he hits him between the eyes and he falls and he dies, and then David runs up and pulls his sword. And the Bible tells us that the Israelite army sees that and they are inspired, and the Israelite army charged and pursued the armies of the Philistines, and they destroyed the entire army of the Philistines that day. This army that once was struck in fear, that once was struck in worry, in doubt, in anxiety, that could not move forward, that could not fight, that could not accomplish anything, all of a sudden is able to accomplish great victory. When we let God slay the giants in our life, we're able to move forward and accomplish great victories afterwards. Oh, we could accomplish some wonderful things today if we would first let God deliver us from the land of giants. I don't know what worry it is that you have today, but let God bring you peace. What doubt you have, but let God bring you assurance. What sin it might be, but let God bring you deliverance. what fear it is, let God bring you peace as well. In the land of giants, I believe that many of us are stuck and have been stuck for a long time with some giants in our lives. And we've been unable to move forward for God because of it. And if we would simply let God slay those giants, we can move forward and accomplish great victories this morning. How about it? In the land of giants? Are we going to continue to hide in fear like the Israelites, or are we going to say, God, deliver me from these giants and allow me to experience great victory? Brother, would you come? Let's sing a song.